Hi, this is Comptroller Brooke Learman welcoming you to the Maryland Association of Counties Conduit Street Podcast, the show that discusses the issues and ideas shaping Maryland policy and politics today.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here today, and I am joined by friend of the podcast, Ben Yelin. He is the Program Director for Public Policy and External Affairs at the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security, also a lecturer in law. And today we're going to dive deep into emergency management, the federal shakeups at FEMA, and what it all means for county governments. Ben, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you again, Kevin.
So I guess, Ben, we need to start with Allegheny County, and it's happenstance that we are recording a podcast on Wednesday, May 14th about emergency management and about all of the chaos that's unfolding at the federal level. But we'll start with Allegheny because we're experiencing out in Western Maryland some terrible flooding right now. I think we just learned that the last time they had an event like this one was in the mid-90s. So infrequent, but these events obviously happen. Our thoughts are with everyone out there, with the emergency management community, with all the first responders, boots on the ground, people who work day and night to make sure that people are safe, have shelter, have food. So we got to start there. And Ben, I think obviously that dovetails into our conversation, but this is just another example. Here we are in May, and we're dealing with this extreme flooding out in Allegheny County in Western Maryland. It's not just Allegheny, but they're bearing the brunt of it. Ben, I mean, these events seem to be happening more and more frequently, and it seems like bad timing to be worried about FEMA and the federal government's ability to respond to help states and local governments during these types of events.
Sure. Obviously, I'll reiterate what you said about folks in Allegheny County. We're all thinking about them. I know this is a very difficult situation. So for those of you who are the boots on the ground there, our thoughts are definitely with you. It is a disturbing time in the world of emergency management, not going to lie. Obviously, the risks are growing, whether it's severe floods like the one we saw in Allegheny County, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's acts of terrorism or civil unrest. There are just a lot of potential disasters out there. We deal with them all the time. All of your counties certainly have dealt with their share of natural and man-made disasters over the past several years. And usually the federal government plays a role in ameliorating the effects of these natural disasters. All natural disasters should start or the response should always start at the local level. Local folks are best situated to be first responders. Obviously, that's where your police departments and fire departments are. But some events are so big that they go beyond the ability of our local folks to fully respond and fully offset these effects. And that's when the state can get involved. Of course, there are times when the state also doesn't have resources, and that's where FEMA has served this crucial role as a funding source of last resort. So one of our concerns right now is that we've seen really bad disasters that have taken place in other states. The one that comes to mind is in Arkansas, where they had severe storms, tornadoes, et cetera. And we've seen really for the first time FEMA rejecting requests for disaster declaration, which would unlock federal funding under the Stafford Act. It's notable for Arkansas because the governor of Arkansas served as President Trump's press secretary in the first term. So it's certainly something that raised the eyebrows of the emergency management community. And then I know we're going to talk more about this, but one of the other things that FEMA does, you don't want to just be spending money on what happens after the disaster. It's really important to be able to prepare for disasters, both to mitigate the impacts, to be resilient against emerging threats. And we've seen through the Department of Government Efficiency and through the fiscal 2026 President Trump's budget proposal, significant cuts to these FEMA preparedness programs. Just through the folks I've talked to at the local level and folks with the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, I just think there's a significant level of concern here that a lot of the functions we take for granted in emergency management in state and local agencies will have to stop occurring in the absence of these critical federal funds.
Right. And absolutely. And I think, if we take a look at the big picture, and I should say up front, too, this is not and should not be taken as a partisan issue. I know we're talking about the current administration, but we're talking about, real world scenarios where counties need to be able to respond, states need to be able to respond. So I know it can get partisan real quick, but this is, I know you aren't, and I am not coming at this in a partisan way. This is about doing the work that counties do every day and being able to do that. So I know it's a partisan world, but really disasters are not partisan. They happen everywhere, and we need to be able to respond. So it is concerning with what's going on, particularly at the federal level. And there's been Conduit Street coverage. Our association, our affiliate, the Association of County Emergency Managers, have sent letters to Congress. We can talk about that. But Ben, let's talk about the big picture. As we said, counties are facing a host of growing threats: extreme weather, infrastructure vulnerabilities, even things like cybersecurity risks, right? You name it. And in Maryland and across the country, counties are on the front lines of these threats. And a lot of that preparedness does depend on strong, robust federal partnerships. So Ben, we've kind of touched on this, but give us a sense of where things stand right now with FEMA and with federal emergency management support. I know last week there was a big shakeup at FEMA. So talk broadly about where things stand in your mind and what we should think right now about FEMA and the ability of FEMA to step up and deliver, crucial support in times of need.
Yeah, so some of this can oftentimes seem very abstract. I'm sure you might quibble with me giving you this statistic because in some ways it's kind of misleading, but I recently became aware that 79% of the funds that go to the Maryland Department of Emergency Management flow from federal grant programs.
Right.
Now, some of that has to do with 911, which is housed within the Department of Emergency Management. But still, that means it's not just the state, but also our localities that are largely reliant on federal funding from FEMA. So what is happening with FEMA? Within the first couple of weeks of President Trump taking office, he said kind of off the cuff during an event responding to the Los Angeles wildfires that he wanted to either end FEMA or significantly reform it. This is something that's been echoed by the Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, which is where FEMA lives. So Kristi Noem, the Secretary, said during a cabinet meeting, also seemingly kind of off the cuff, that I think the exact quote is, "We're ending FEMA." So obviously that was kind of a statement that made shockwaves. There was a acting administrator of FEMA. They had not made a nomination to go through the Senate for a full-on administrator. So somebody was the administrator in an acting capacity. He was at a hearing just last week, and he was asked about the president's comments, the secretary's comments about ending FEMA as we know it. And one of the members of Congress asked him, "Do you think this is a good idea?" And his answer was rather short and direct. He said, "No, it's not a good idea. FEMA provides valuable services." He's not in support of that. The next day he was fired. So I can't prove that there's a direct connection between that dismissal of that acting administrator and his comments, but certainly the timing was notable.
And Ben, I mean, and that, there are a lot of people working at FEMA, right, who are trying to navigate these leadership changes and then also do their everyday work, which again is really important. So, I mean, if you're someone sitting at FEMA right now, these types of people. I'm sure you may even know people who work there. I mean, what does this have to do for morale? And at what point do we think that, they're still doing their jobs in a way that can be supportive, especially when you have now someone at the helm who seemingly is on board with, let's just get rid of FEMA?
Yeah, so the new acting administrator came on, and there was a meeting that I think, to put it mildly, was kind of alarming to FEMA staff, at least the ones I saw quoted in some of the major publications, where it was basically like, "Don't go against the mission." I think he said something like, "I don't abide by yield signs in my work." So yeah, I think it's a really difficult time at FEMA just because of the uncertainty. There are a lot of amazing career folks there who just do amazing work. It's not just in grant funding, but some of the specialized work that FEMA does, specific types of disaster teams, developing some of the document templates that we all rely on for things like emergency operations plan, continuity of operations planning. This is just critical work that all of us in this community have relied on for a long time. And I can only imagine, just like you, that morale just must be difficult because there's so much uncertainty about the future of the agency. We saw in the president's budget request or the president's budget proposal, that they're calling for about $400 million in cuts to FEMA preparedness grants and then other cuts elsewhere to the agency. And I think there's been some conversation longer term about transferring FEMA's duties to other federal entities and then devolving a lot of the remaining duties to state and local governments, which I think, for reasons that you know probably better than anyone else, is a very risky proposition.
And Ben, on that note, I mean, so I think a lot of this is being sold as no, 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 we're just restoring the power to where it should be back to the states and the local governments. They're best suited. They know their communities, they know what they need. They know how to do it. But obviously, what we're missing there is states and local governments do not have the resources of the federal government. And that is, again, why FEMA exists, to deal with these large scale events, to provide crucial support, like you said, to prepare and provide resilience strategies and funding. And so when we talk about, oh, we're gonna give all that back to the states and the localities, they're the ones who are best equipped to handle that kind of stuff because they know their communities. Obviously, what we're missing there, and what I think what you're alluding to, that's a huge risk, right? Number one, it's scale and equity, and which states have the resources, which ones don't, which counties, which municipalities. But I think it's fair to say no state, no local government has the kind of resources to handle some of the large scale events that we've seen just in the past year. I mean, look at the fires in California. You mentioned Arkansas. Look at what we're seeing in Allegheny. I mean, the big, small, large, massive scale, all of these things, when they rise to the level of FEMA, it's for a reason. It's because the states have asked for that kind of help because they're not in a position where they can handle the funding and the recovery, et cetera. So when you hear things like that, we're just going to shift it back. I mean, obviously we're missing that funding piece, but just broadly, what resources are out there that could even come close to doing what if FEMA disappeared tomorrow, what happens?
It is a scary proposition. I think it's definitely one that we all have to think about. I think you said it really well. The axiom that all emergencies are local, I think, has a significant grain of truth in it. Local first responders are best suited. They know their communities best. But it's not like these alternative proposals are to give giant block grants of significant amounts of money to state and local governments.
Right.
That's not what the president is proposing. The reason this counts as budget savings is because the money that used to go out through all of these FEMA grant programs isn't going to go out anymore.
So we're not talking about we're going to give them more control over how to spend the money, how to dole it out, give the authority to the boots on the ground on how to deal with these resources. It's just we're not going to dole out the resources. We're going to let them figure it out.
Absolutely. It would be a totally different ballgame if this was we are really going to do our best to support local control. Here's a giant pile of money to allow local folks to make decisions on emergency preparedness. That would be a completely different ballgame, but that's just not where we are, at least according to the proposals we've seen and the actions of the Department of Government Efficiency. So you talk about alternatives. Honestly, the alternatives aren't great. There are some state resources. We have a state catastrophic event account, which I know has been used for natural disasters. In 2023, the General Assembly, I think certainly with your guys' help, set up the statewide disaster relief fund. So for an event where there wouldn't be a federal disaster declaration, something that's maybe on a slightly smaller scale, the state can issue its own disaster declaration that would unlock certain funding sources for local governments.
But how about a large scale event, not something that the state would typically be prepared to handle, even with the things that you just talked about, the catastrophic event account, the local, the statewide disaster recovery fund. What about for large scale events where typically we would rely upon FEMA? Is there anywhere else where states and local governments could go if FEMA just disappeared tomorrow?
I mean, the short answer is not really, and that's what's most disturbing about all of this. To try and put a positive spin on it, mutual aid agreements if there's something happens in Allegheny County, which is a smaller county, and they have a mutual aid agreement with one of the larger counties, maybe that's a way for an event like this that they could obtain resources. But if we're talking about a hurricane that blows through the entire state, that kind of defeats the purpose of mutual aid because every county would be suffering under that type of scenario. So,
right. And counties are really good at mutual aid, especially here in Maryland. States also have mutual aid agreements with one another. But like you just said, in a scenario where you have a hurricane that has a regional effect, maybe that's where, those agreements sort of just dissolve because everyone's dealing with the same thing all at once. So again, that's the point of FEMA. And I think that is what's so concerning. Ben, I also want to talk about, I think you mentioned it earlier, BRIC funding. I want to talk about the BRIC program. I want you to kind of walk through that, why it's so important. And again, this is something that Maryland emergency managers have raised formally now in letters to Congress. We've talked about this a lot on the Conduit Street blog, and we'll link that coverage. But talk about BRIC, Ben, what happened and why folks are up in arms and super, super concerned.
So BRIC stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. This is a program that has existed for the past 5 or so years. It is a FEMA grant program. They give money to states and localities for resilience projects. So things like hardening our infrastructure to protect against cyber incidents or building levees that can prevent cities from being flooded in the event of a Category 5 hurricane. Anything that makes a community more resilient in the event of some type of natural disaster would at least be eligible for BRIC funds. And over the past several years, a lot of these funds have already been allocated. I know you guys talked extensively about this in your blog, to states and localities. At the end of March, FEMA came out with an announcement that the BRIC program was being canceled. When asked why, they just said it's wasteful and it's ineffective. But this is certainly news to communities in Maryland who were relying on BRIC funding to harden the infrastructure to mitigate the impact of some of these cuts. And we're talking about millions and millions of dollars. I think for projects that were near completion, they were allowed to continue using originally allocated BRIC funding. But even things where they'd gone through the planning process, they'd already received approval. There are a bunch of examples I know that you guys wrote about in your blog post.
Right.
That Monday, the money was just pulled out without any notice. And I think that's going to have a really detrimental impact on the state. In the absence of that money, you have to either not do the work to make your infrastructure more resilient, or you have some difficult choices. Do you allocate money from elsewhere in your local budgets, which is a very difficult thing to do in these kind of lean budget times? Do you raise property taxes? Never an option that localities want to consider. So this will certainly have major consequences. And I'm glad that you have put kind of a coalition together to object to these cuts. And I've spoken to members or staff members of our Maryland federal delegation. I think almost all of them are huge supporters of BRIC funding. There's bipartisan support of the BRIC program. I know there's a congressional letter that's circulating that's been signed by 2 Republican and 2 Democratic senators. I think it has about 80 signatures in the House of Representatives. So at least there's hope that maybe with this public groundswell of support for this program, maybe it'll get reinstituted. But there's certainly a lot of uncertainty around it right now.
Right. I know you were down on the Hill just this week and talking to folks about this. And of course, this is in the context of broader budget cuts that could impact, things like Medicaid in Maryland. It's a huge line item, but that just adds to the worry in terms of if we're going to get major cuts in disaster funding and resilience funding, you also have to take a look at the other cuts, and that affects the state's ability to kind of backfill, certainly. So we talked about MACo, and you talked about a coalition. And, we have the MACo, the county emergency managers here in Maryland. Like I mentioned earlier, they've sent letters to Maryland's congressional delegation, one supporting FEMA's continued mission, and the other urging the restoration of this building resilient infrastructure and communities, the BRIC program funding. So Ben, I mean, obviously, we're talking about FEMA and we're talking about BRIC, and I think those are the two major pieces of this podcast, and we're potentially looking at the elimination of both. You say that there's some hope to restore BRIC, and I'm with you there. There is bipartisan support, but that we know is a huge deal. Obviously, FEMA would be, I can't even think about what would happen if FEMA just disappeared, especially when we're thinking about what's going on in Allegheny County right now. And you're right, this isn't a hypothetical thing when it comes to BRIC. Maryland counties across the state had shovel-ready projects lined up, talking about stormwater upgrades, flood mitigation, coastal protections. All that money was pulled and is certainly in limbo now. But again, as we talk about real world impacts, this is not just in theory. More severe weather, more flooding, more infrastructure failures. Again, what's happening right now in Allegheny. I mean, we do have a state disaster recovery fund that was, you mentioned earlier, that was passed a few years ago with MACo's support. This year, they passed a bill to make it easier to transfer money to that fund. So it would reduce the timeline that you had. There's sort of a waiting period before you can transfer money between the catastrophic event account and this fund. Now it's a shorter timeline, but there isn't much money there. We know that so much of this is tied to federal support. And, we've talked about sort of what other options are out there. But Ben, I mean, outside of mutual aid, outside of raising state revenue, local revenue, we talk about public-private partnerships. I mean, what can emergency managers be doing right now? What should local elected officials be thinking about right now in terms of worst case scenario? But even in terms of if we lose all the BRIC funding, FEMA is still there. Maybe it's changed a lot, but we need to start planning. I know that people don't like putting money in the sock. We like to spend money on things and get instant results, gratification. It's really hard to convince people to think long term and to put money away for events like this one in Allegheny, or wildfires or hurricanes, things that we know will eventually happen, but they aren't date certain. What should local elected officials, emergency managers be doing right now in the midst of all of this and trying to prepare for a very uncertain future?
So one thing is coalition building, which I know you're already doing. There are a lot of FEMA existing funding streams that go not just to one or two counties, but to regions. So we work with a lot of grants from what's called the Urban Area Security Initiative that go to the National Capital Region. So those are the counties surrounding DC, and to Baltimore for all different types of planning activities. Our organization has run tabletop exercises on if there were disruptions in the supply chain that caused massive food shortages in Baltimore. And we got everybody in the room, from the emergency managers from the surrounding counties, to have a discussion about ways to procure additional food resources, how we would work with Maryland food banks, et cetera. I guess the point I'm making there is the larger the coalition, the more influence you're going to have. And when we're talking about funding sources that aren't just going to impact individual counties, but groups of counties, I think the more that you can form relationships with individuals from surrounding counties and kind of work together on just the types of efforts that you guys have engaged in this type of letter writing and advocacy. From a policy perspective, I completely agree with what you said about how it's just, especially in these lean budget times, to think about allocating funding to any type of preparedness or resilience efforts when you will not necessarily see a payoff. There's never 100% certainty that a severe storm is going to hurt any given area. But I do think because of the massive importance of this, because we have decades of horror stories about communities that weren't prepared, about portions of the infrastructure that had not been hardened, organizations where their key records hadn't been digitized and they were using paper records, and those papers were stored in a warehouse and the warehouse burned down in a wildfire. We've seen enough of those stories to know that no matter how difficult it is, in the absence of that federal funding, I think states and localities, to the best of their abilities, have to step up one way or another. So in the short term, it's forming those partnerships, getting in coalitions, especially cross-county coalitions where there's kind of a force multiplier in having more people from diverse jurisdictions write to their members of Congress, write to the federal government, et cetera. But in the absence of that, if we do reach that kind of emergency management disaster area where funding dries up completely, I do think it's something that somehow, some way, the state and the counties are going to have to backfill with other funding sources. And I know that's just a very scary proposition, especially for people like you guys who know how to crunch the numbers. Like there's not just readily available streams of funding everywhere. That's just not how our budget situation is right now.
Definitely not. And Ben, I guess another thing I think about and worry about is that we are in lean budget times, and our local emergency management offices often are so reliant on grant funding as well as their community partners who they rely upon so much in doing the work out in the community. When you're in lean budget times and you're thinking about, well, we're going to lose all of our grant funding, I think oftentimes what can happen is you kind of go into your silo and you don't talk to other people. You don't travel to networking events. You don't engage as much because, like you said, times are lean, grant funding's drying up. So I know you and I have talked about trying to think outside the box and make sure that there are, pathways and availability for people to talk to one another and to exchange ideas and work with one another. But that's also got to be concerning. I think we saw some of this during COVID, where, people just tend to go into silos. I know that in these times, especially with emergency management and especially with mutual aid, it's more important than ever. So give us some I don't know, maybe give us a rosy hope in terms of giving people the ability to connect with one another. What should they be doing? How do we prevent people from going into silos and still engaging and being proactive with one another?
I guess the rosy hope is that people really do have a lot of power in this space. We didn't have much of a federal infrastructure for emergency management 30 years ago. Really, emergency management as a discipline took off with September 11th and with Hurricane Katrina. Those were kind of galvanizing events. And those events built up public groundswell for federal funding, and that funding has supported expansions to state emergency management offices and local offices of emergency management. I agree with you. There is that temptation to be siloed. It can feel kind of like the Hunger Games, where you just want to make sure your own county is taken care of, and you might have your funding secured until September 30th, and you don't have the capacity to worry about what's happening in the county next door.
Right.
But I think it's as I said, it's a force multiplier to have a larger coalition. I also think, frankly, it's important to have representation from all different types of Maryland communities, especially rural communities in Western Maryland, as we've seen with this event, and on the Eastern Shore, and to have powerful advocates there. This isn't a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. Disasters happen everywhere. I think we've seen in states and localities that have recently suffered disasters, you've had Republican members stand up to the administration and write letters on behalf of their constituents. I've been thinking of Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, suffered greatly from, was it Hurricane Helene last year, where there were just devastating floods in Western North Carolina. And he's become a champion for emergency management and federal funding. And he supported the Democratic governor as they've made requests to continue funding, which I believe their initial request was rejected at first by the administration. So building kind of cross-cutting coalitions with representation, not just from urban and suburban counties, but folks on the Eastern Shore and in Western Maryland, we need those folks. We need them to be part of this coalition to help prevent these cuts from happening if possible, and if not, to kind of rally the state around the cause of preparedness and emergency management, and work with state and local lawmakers to figure out a way to make resources available even in the worst case scenario.
Amen to that. I think that's well said, Ben. And again, disasters are not partisan, and we need to think about this in ways that are not partisan, try to bring everyone to the table. That's what MACo does. I know that's what you do, and you all do such a good job at University of Maryland and in terms of bringing people together and creating those environments, especially at the Center for Health and Homeland Security. So, Ben, I really appreciate your time today. I know we've covered a lot. our minds are certainly on Allegheny County. Anything you want to close with here, Ben, before we kind of wrap up in terms of just the landscape of emergency management, the concerns about FEMA and BRIC, and so many other things? I mean, if you're in the seat right now as a county emergency manager, you're worried about all this stuff. What are your closing thoughts to them, and what they can do to sort of, alleviate the stress and again try and get through these trying times and operate in a way that they need to when they're dealing with so much uncertainty at the federal level?
I think first, you're not alone. It's not only happening in every county within our state, but it's happening across the country. So there's some solidarity in knowing that this is a group effort, especially when it came to BRIC funding. I mean, I've just seen horror stories from diverse communities all across the country. So knowing that you do have that solidarity, we're all working toward the same goal, and I think there is real strength in numbers and coalition building just to highlight the importance of this type of funding and find advocates who can speak out on your behalf. And frankly, me and you, Kevin, maybe we can. Maybe we're not the best faces in terms of being champions of this cause, but I know it's something that you and I both deeply believe in. So I don't want to speak for you, but from my perspective, like I'd love to hear from local emergency managers on what the direct impact is from BRIC funding cuts or anticipated funding cuts from other FEMA programs, whether it's UASI, whether it's regional catastrophic preparedness grants, whatever it is. I would love to talk with you about what the impact is, and do my best to kind of advocate as best I can for this cause that I believe in.
Yeah, and I know you and I personally and professionally believe in this deeply, and so I think there'll be more to come. We'll continue to engage with our emergency managers in the emergency management community, and again, this is very much on our minds, and we're very much wanting to support them in any way that we can. So, Ben, we very much appreciate, again, your time. We'll link all of your information in the show notes. We're going to go ahead and leave it there for today. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook and Twitter. And then, of course, don't forget to read the Conduit Street blog. As I mentioned, we have a ton of coverage on all things federal, especially when it comes to funding and emergency management and everything else. So we'll make sure you have links to the blog as well. But for Ben Yelin and our esteemed producer, Chantal Malcolm Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.